It is quite remarkable to see just how much the ANC, and by implication the South African government, has become the monster that it has sworn to destroy.
We will be able to use the country's resources in a more efficient manner and to prevent the corruption which is so endemic in the National Party government. We have committed ourselves to leaders trying to lead a style of life similar to those of the community. We are not going to live like fat cats. The days of the gravy trains are gone. Everybody should know that.
After growing international concern about the crisis in South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa and the South African government has announced that the country would embark on what has been called a national dialogue to discuss the crisis in South Africa and the way forward. Now, in a recent report published by Lex Libertas entitled Reclaiming Freedom, we make the point that the crisis in South Africa could be summed up under three categories. The first being a very destructive policy framework with a ruling party that seems to believe that the only way to prosperity is through race-based redistribution. Secondly, state failure in general, with crime escalating, the government not being able to provide basic services such as electricity and water, and the failure of virtually every government department and every state-owned enterprise. And thirdly, the persecution of minorities, with a network of more than 140 race laws, policies aimed at expropriating or confiscating the property belonging to minorities, the chanting of Kill the Boer, the entrenchment of double standards through the justice system, and so forth. However, this report goes on to make the point that these crises are in fact not the crisis in itself, but symptoms of a deeper rooted crisis. The actual underlying crisis is nestled in the fact that the country is firstly very big, secondly very diverse, and thirdly that it suffers from high levels of poverty and unemployment. Yet, the country is governed by a highly centralized government, in many ways detached from realities on ground level, that only foresees race-based redistribution as the way forward. And so the question is if this so-called national dialogue would contribute in any significant way to addressing the actual underlying problems, the foundational crisis of the South African constitutional dispensation. The plans for this dialogue is already soaked in controversy, with the budget being over 700 million South African rands, or over 40 million US dollars. And people who are involved or who are trying to be involved expressing concern that the president and the presidency is doing what is necessary to maintain sole control over key aspects of the process. There is already some concerns that with this national dialogue, the Public Finance Management Act is being violated in the sense that due process is not followed for expenditures in this regard. And there are concerns about what has been described as contrasting assessments and an absence of internal alignment and coordination in the arrangement of this national dialogue. But there are also logistical problems, with invitations being sent electronically just before the website broke down. Now, it has been announced that this national dialogue will be championed by a so-called Eminent Persons Group, but it is also very clear that the members of this group were chosen to ensure that the ideological worldview of the ANC will prevail at this national dialogue. And also, on the other hand, that views that do not align with this worldview of the ANC would be marginalized in the process. Now, this is once again an example of the ANC becoming the very thing that it has sworn to destroy. While the ANC was still in struggle, its former president, Albert Lethuli, expressed the organization's criticism towards the white minority government or the National Party government in South Africa, saying that they have a strange affinity for weak leaders. What he meant by that was that whenever there was a crisis in the country that had to be resolved, the National Party government usually announced that it would embark on discussions about solutions, but would then ensure that they only speak with people that already agree with their grand political project. The ANC described people like these as weak leaders, as people who do not have the backbone to stand up to the government. And so not only is it quite remarkable that the ANC clings to the very thing that they were so critical of, but also that the people who are being invited by the ANC to act in this regard are actually regarded by the ANC as weak leaders according to their own evaluation. Now, one weak leader in particular is, of course, the good friend of Cyril Ramaphosa, Roelf Meyer. The issue of Afrikaners and Afrikaners being targeted in South Africa has reached some international scrutiny, and the president has made it clear that he is committed to addressing these concerns. Now, if you know the ANC, it should not be a surprise that they particularly chose Roelf Meyer to act on this Eminent Persons Group, presumably as some form of a spokesperson or representative for the Afrikaner people, especially considering that no other prominent Afrikaners are in any significant role involved with this national dialogue. Now, it's worth taking a moment to just explain who exactly Roelf Meyer is, not for the sake of discussing Roelf Meyer, but for the sake of exposing this national dialogue and the ANC's modus operandi. Now, Roelf Meyer is generally regarded by the Afrikaner people as one of the greatest turncoats in Afrikaner history, on par with someone like Piet de Wet, the brother of the famous Boer War general Christian de Wet. Piet de Wet has decided during the Anglo-Boer War that it would be better to side with the British and to fight against his own people. In similar fashion, Roelf Meyer has repeatedly throughout his political career sided with the ANC in making key decisions to the detriment of the Afrikaner people, while creating the impression that he is there to represent Afrikaner interests. For example, Meyer led the negotiations during the early 1990s on behalf of the National Party government with the ANC to discuss what a future South Africa would look like. And it soon became clear that the ANC, and Cyril Ramaphosa in particular, who was the chief negotiator for the ANC, took a very particular liking in Roelf Meyer, precisely due to the fact that they saw him as the weakest link in the Afrikaner establishment, as a result of the fact that he consistently caved in under pressure from the ANC, conceding to their demands on virtually every issue. This went up to the point where, once these negotiations were concluded, Ramaphosa himself was baffled by the extent to which someone like Meyer was satisfied with the outcome after he had caved in on issue after issue.
I was able to see Roelf Meyer for the first time dancing on the floor where we were having this party. He was quite happy, he was quite jovial, and I kept wondering whether I would have been as happy as he was if I was in his position, having finally given in the way that they had.
Now, if this is not an example of what is generally described as the phenomenon of useful idiots, then I do not know what a useful idiot is. In his later life, Meyer himself has acknowledged on national television that he is in fact a liar, that during his political career he has made promises to his constituency, to the Afrikaner people in particular, knowing very well that he has no intention of keeping those promises, because, according to him, that is just the way politicians are.
Wat die politiek aanbetref, het 'n mens partykeer beloftes gemaak wat jy geweet het nie kan waar word nie. Dit is so. And alle politici is so.
And so lately, the various institutions or organizations in South Africa has had to grapple with the decision as to whether they should participate in this national dialogue. One institution has said that they intend to participate because they cannot afford to stand on the sidelines while others make decisions on their behalf. The truth is somewhat different though. The truth is that those who intend to participate will not have any capacity to make decisions to a greater extent than those who would not be there, because it has been made very clear from the outset that the decisions that would be taken at this discussion will be aligned with the ideological worldview and the political project of the ANC. And so the question is not so much about whether one should stand on the sidelines as opposed to whether one should participate, but rather whether one would be willing to serve as a rubber stamp for those who are arranging this dialogue. This is not our national dialogue. It is not a national dialogue for the various nations and communities that live in South Africa. It is a national dialogue arranged by the ANC and the South African government to save face, to create the impression that they are committed to resolving the issues in this country, while the dialogue is structured in such a way that it cannot address the issues that ought to be addressed. And so you might say that there are 6 problems with this national dialogue. The first is the cost, with extreme amounts of money being spent on this and an alarming amount of concerns about the way this money is being spent and the processes that are currently being followed to spend this money. The second is the complete lack of representativity in the people who have been chosen by the president and the government to lead this process, which makes it clear that they wish to ensure from the get-go that the process is controlled and that it cannot deviate from the political project of the ruling ANC and its commitment to what they describe as a national democratic revolution. Thirdly, there is no indication that this dialogue will lead to any significant political change, that any of the underlying issues as a result of which South Africa is suffering would be addressed in a way that would contribute to any form of a solution. Fourthly, it is very clear that this is simply a case of political posturing, of misuse of government resources, and of window dressing, of pretending to do something in response to the problem and the criticisms when it is nothing more than a delay tactic to assist them in not addressing these problems in any tangible way. Which leads to the 5th point, that it is nothing other than a delaying tactic. It is very clear what needs to be done in South Africa, but those in power do not want to do what needs to be done because it isn't aligned with their ideological project. And so, instead of doing what needs to be done, the excuse is to say that they would hold a national dialogue which would undoubtedly lead to further correspondence, further discussions, further commissions, and so forth, all of which is an excuse not to address the issues that ought to be addressed. And finally, it is very clear that the outcome of this discussion has been predetermined and that those who intend to participate would not achieve anything more than to serve as a rubber stamp by strengthening the excuse of those in power and the masquerade that they are doing something when in fact they are deflecting from addressing the underlying issues that ought to be addressed. The South African political dispensation is a house of cards. This house is collapsing, and the reason why it is collapsing is obvious. It is there for all to see. It is because the foundations are flawed to the core. This national dialogue will be a discussion about how to paint over the cracks while the house is collapsing, when what needs to be done is to go back to the very foundations as a result of which this collapse is happening. And the only way to tangibly address the flawed foundation is to build a house on proper foundations, which would include ensuring a decentralized political system that would facilitate self-governance for the various peoples and nations living within this beautiful country.